I'm going to call Andrew Little.
Mr Chairman, I rise to make some comments on the Administration of Community Sentences and Orders Bill, and begin by saying, Mr Chairman, that we all acknowledge, in fact the government spends a lot of time telling us that we have a lower crime rate, although I think the reality is we have a lower prosecution rate increasingly, and we know that police officers and the police force have been instructed to minimise the number of charges that they now lay against offenders, and that therefore reduces the prosecution rate, makes the figures look good, but there is a real question about whether the crime rate is actually dropping. That said, Mr Chairman, policies focused on, once we get to the offenders themselves, certainly the convicted offenders, policies that are focused on both correction and rehabilitation are much better than those that are just focused on the more punitive elements which goes with incarceration. So, Mr Chairman, that's why, as a general principle, we are Labor supportive of this bill and of this legislation, and indeed, and I think as Chris Farfoy acknowledged, credit where credit is due, some of the measures that the present Minister of Corrections is taking to assist those who are presently incarcerated to make a real fist of adjusting post-release. And we know that there are good programs in the prisons now on literacy and on work readiness and on community readiness, if you like, getting ready to go back into the community. And I was greatly privileged in the visit that I and Chris Farfoy and Darren Fenton took to Tandem earlier this year to see one of the programs in place and the efforts that have been taken to have people readjust, ready for post-release. But it is better if we can avoid incarceration, acknowledging that there needs to be punishment, acknowledging that there needs to be a sanction, but where it is at all possible for sentences to be served in the community, whether through home detention, whether through a curfew, whether through other community sentences, that is surely better. And just as we can say with some certainty that there are some people for whom prison is inevitable because of the nature of their offending, their violent personality, their antisocial personality, equally we can say that there are some people for whom prison is completely the wrong thing. They may act antisocially, they may be committing crimes, certainly at the low end of the scale. Generally, they will be younger people, and they are the ones who, if we possibly can avoid it, we should avoid sending them to prison. And so a community-based sentence is entirely appropriate. So we welcome this legislation that tidies up some of those aspects, that enables the courts, when they're dealing with community sentences that need to be extended or adjusted or amended, that there is now a process for doing that. That allows probation officers whose role is to get close to offenders in the community and manage their rehabilitation in the community, gives them greater scope to assist the offenders for whom they are responsible to adjust and to adapt. And that, hopefully, Mr Chairman, hopefully, but we are optimistic and we should be confident, will lead to a lower recidivism rate, a more effective process for rehabilitation. And so we welcome all those aspects of it. We should not forget that community sentences, particularly curfews and home detention, and indeed those people who are required to provide work and contribute their efforts for a certain period of hours, they are still a restriction on liberty. There are plenty of people in the community who forget that it is the restriction on liberty that is the ultimate punishment for people who, when they offend against our criminal statutes, we call upon to be sanctioned, and it is that restriction of liberty that is that sanction. But we need to make sure that having done that in this sort of way, that the mechanisms and the tools that we have to manage those sorts of sentences are effective and offer sufficient flexibility. We know with electronic monitoring there has been a problem, and I know that the regime or the governance now of our electronic monitoring in the criminal justice system has been changed, so the Department of Corrections now has responsibility for it. That's right. We have had people who not only breached their electronic monitoring conditions, but have absconded on it. And we've had the dreadful situation, Mr Chairman.
Andrew Little.
The dreadful and unfortunate situation of the offender in Palmerston North, who was on home detention, being electronically monitored, who managed to get away, not just get out of Palmerston North, but get out of the country and went to Canada and ended up murdering a person there earlier this year. So good that we're beefing that up. In terms of part two, the new arrangements or the flexible arrangements for amending and changing sentences make absolute sense. And in terms of new section 66A, I want to acknowledge that I think that is a good change to allow some of that community service, where the community services are for 80 hours or more, for some of that to be regarded as training. And I acknowledge that and congratulate the Minister on what I think will be a very good move, and allow those who have to do work and as by way of penance for their offending to actually get something out of it beyond just work experience, but get something that they can show for it, a certification of what they've done and their skills. And I think that will make a big difference to the sort of people who find themselves who are candidates for this sort of sentencing. I want to simply add a word of caution about one aspect of it, and I know this has been through the Select Committee, and my colleagues on the committee and indeed the Labour caucus have supported it, but I do just want to make a note of caution, really with my pedantic, overzealous justice hat on, because you can't be a justice spokesperson without being a zealot on occasions, and that is in relation to the new 69JA and clause 22A and the new section 80FA and clause 27A, and that is about the role of the Chief Executive. Now, we know that the way this operates is, of course, that it's not the Chief Executive. It won't be Ray Smith sitting in his office making all these, approving these changes of residence and locations of the way these sentences are going to be served out. It is going to be somebody in the Department of Corrections who will have this responsibility. My concern is this, is that these sentences are imposed by judges, by officers of the court. They carry a judicial imprimatur and a proper judicial sanction. There is oversight by the probationary service, that is kind of the operational end of the criminal justice system. I understand all that, but I get a little nervous when it comes to adjusting and changing what are effectively orders of the court. They go to an official, the identity of whom may well be unknown, and therefore the accountability for which may be somewhat diffuse. And I simply raise that point and get it on the record, so that in the hopefully unfortunate event and hopefully unlikely event that something does go wrong with this administration, that has been noted. And I'm sure a conscientious minister, for as long as she is in the role at least, will at some point want to review the practices that emerge around all this and the track record, and if it calls for it, maybe to, if there are too many unfortunate events, look at whether it is appropriate for a senior official within the Department of Corrections to be making or mandating these changes, or whether or not it should go back to the court, even the registrar of the court, or at least some expedited process within the court, to ensure that the decisions that get taken and the offender who is being managed at all times has the imprimatur of a judge in terms of the sentence that they are serving and carrying out. Notwithstanding all that, Mr Chairman, as my colleagues have said, we support the legislation. This does have the potential to offer some good and effective changes and a more positive future for those offenders who find themselves in this situation but who can be managed in the community, serve out their time, suffer the sanction that is imposed on them, but turn out to be good citizens at the end of that, and that is a welcome development.
I call Jan Logie.
Mr Chair,